Right, what we do today is look at some of the perhaps more detailed rules affecting English consonants. And first of all, I want to take a number of allophonic rules, realization rules. Linis obstruent devoicing. Linis obstruens. Linis, you think of it as a synonym for voiced, though as we shall see it's precisely because it isn't a synonym for voiced that we need to have a separate symbol for linis. Obstruents are the sounds that are not sonorous. So the linis obstruents of English are the plosives, the affricate, and the frecatives listed there. And I say, although we can start off by thinking of these as voiced, and we can certainly argue that in phonological terms they're voiced, nevertheless, phonetically, in terms of articulation, it is not true that the vocal cords always vibrate when you pronounce these consonants. That's the matter we need to look at now. The simplest way to say what happens is, I think, the one line you've got on the handout sheet to say that these sounds are devoiced or partially devoiced when they're adjacent to a voiceless segment or to a pause. By a pause I mean silence. So if we take D, for example, and we have a word such as ladder, okay, that's fully voiced. It's surrounded by voiced sounds, ladder, and if you investigate the activity of the vocal folds, you typically find that they're vibrating throughout, so you've been taught to draw parametric diagrams of that kind, where we see full vibration of the vocal folds during the hold phase of the word ladder. However, if we take dad as a one-word utterance on its own, then you don't get vibration of the vocal folds throughout the hold phase of the D at either end. That is, in English we don't say dad. We don't say dad, we say dad. Dad, 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 dad. There is a degree of devoicing of the initial and final plosives when they're adjacent to the silence of pause or of nothingness here. Now, the degree of this devoicing is variable, and of course it may depend very much upon the rate of speech, how deliberate you're being, and so on. All we can say is that it clearly makes English sound odd if you have full voicing, if you say da. Indeed, if you have voicing before the moment of release, we can sort of conventionally show that with 1/3 of voicing. That's perhaps quite a good way to draw parametric diagrams when you're a beginner. But if you actually look at a spectrogram, you may well find no voicing at all during the whole phase, and voicing starting only at the moment of release of the articulators, dad. And equal at the end, you may get the voicing switching off virtually at the moment of contact of the tension against the alveolar ridge. So we've got this tendency to devoice adjacent to silence. You can see it as the silence slurring over into the otherwise voiced portion of the consonant. Equally, we have this in connected speech. If we have voiced obstruents where they've got a voiceless fortis obstruent immediately adjacent to them. So if we take the word dog, like dad there, and it's surrounded, got the word this before it, this dog, that will typically, the voicelessness of the S will typically slur over into the D, giving you a partially or indeed wholly devoiced D or dog. We don't say this dog. We certainly don't, as in many languages, say this dog. Some languages assimilate voicing in the way of making everything voiced. This dog. That's what happens in French, for example. Place de la Concorde becomes Place de la Concorde. We don't do that in English. It's a difference between English and French. In English, the assimilatory pressure is always towards devoicing this dog. And equally, if this dog seems to have got lost, then because of the S there, you get early switch off of the voicing in the plosive. It's dogs, dogs, dogs. So we get this linis devoicing adjacent to silence or adjacent to a voiceless segment. Now you might think that this would have the consequence that these voiceless, these devoiced linis obstruents end up sounding the same as the corresponding voiceless ones. That a D would sound like a T, and that a Z would sound like an S, and so on. But that's not so. In the phrase, this dog seems to have got lost, it doesn't sound like talk. It doesn't sound like this talk seems. Equally, if you say dad in isolation, it doesn't sound like tat. So now we've got to ask why. And this really is the crux of the justification for using the terms fortis and linis in phonetic description, because they subsume all the various different bits and pieces that cause a devoiced D nevertheless to sound different from a T, or a devoiced Z to sound different from an S. What are these various features? Well, some of them are things that are sort of obvious and separate, like aspiration. If we had the word talk, you get strong aspiration of the T, whereas a D, however much you devoice it, doesn't become aspirated. So that's going to be something that keeps them apart. That's not going to help us much with fricatives, but it certainly does with plosives. There is the business of pre-fortis clipping the effect on the preceding vowel. If it were talk, you've got the K exerting its pre-fortis clipping effect on the vowel, but not the dog. So that's another reason why they stay apart. And that's going to help with the fricatives as well as with the plosives. But even setting all of those things aside, there are clearly further matters that are different. We can even look in positions of what you might think of as neutralization to demonstrate that the difference that exists. Suppose we take past tenses. Past tense of touch is touched. Past tense of judge is judged. Now, we tell you you've got to transcribe them like that, and that this is ordinary T of touched and T of judged, in spite of the fact that the difference is predictable in this environment, and therefore you can argue that the distinction is neutralized. Okay, but nevertheless the phonetic difference is still present, even though if we say the word at the end of the sentence, you're going to get absolutely no voicing in the D bit of judged. Indeed, if we say this word in isolation, there's no voicing during the friction of the affricate. You can try by saying it aloud, judged, judged, judged. You can hear that. No vocal cord vibrating there at the end. And yet, judged does not rhyme with touched. Why not? Because touched ends in So what is the difference between what we have in judged, namely, and what we have in touched, namely, and you can hear it's a matter of how noisy it is. In judged, it's very gentle. In touched, it's much noisier, much more pressure. Now, exactly how this is produced by the organs of speech is perhaps still the subject of some controversy. I think the most plausible account is that when we devoice lenis obstruens, the vocal folds don't go into the wide open position, they go into the whisper position. That is, they go to the narrowed position that would give rise to whisper if you tried to say a vowel sound with whisper. Now, in everyday language, whisper, of course, is what you do when you talk like that. But that means that the voiceless segments remain voiceless, vocal folds wide open. But what would otherwise be voiced segments, like vowels and things, have the vocal folds narrowed. And that's sufficient to present considerable obstruction, impediment, to the free flow of air, thereby reducing the airflow in the oral cavity. And of course adding the noise component that we hear from the vocal folds. So you get that kind of noise plus much reduced flow of air through the mouth. This means if we then make an obstruction in the mouth, like in Africa, if there's much less flow of air, there's much less pressure of air behind it. So that during the friction stage there's much less noise of local friction to be heard, and once you release a plosive, there's much less burst noise to come from that. So this really seems the most likely account, that this devoicing, when we say that sounds become devoiced, it means that the vocal folds go into whisper mode, that's into narrowed position, rather than going into voiceless mode, that is wide open position. And that accounts for the differences that we can observe between them, and justifies us in saying that they are still distinct. That would mean that the English D phoneme, for example, has among its allophones fully voiced D and whispered devoiced D. And these are both members of the D phoneme and not members of the T phoneme, and similarly with all other pairs of voices. This devoicing applies not only to single lenis obstruents, but also to clusters of lenis obstruents. We have, of course, some clusters that differ in voicing. In jump, for example, we've got M and T, and there the vocal folds appear to switch pretty promptly as you go from one segment to the next. You don't get voicing assimilation effects at all. There are other kinds of devoicing effect that are sometimes claimed, but I feel a bit dubious about. If you have initial snow, for example, do we get devoicing of the N here? Do we say it's snow? And the answer is no, we don't. Snow, we say snow, snow, snow. And I think there's voicing during most of the N, at least in fairly slow speech. Snow, what happens in rapid speech, of course, may be something different. Snow. So the non-obstruents, that's the resonance, liquids, nasals, semivowels, don't get affected in the same way. They also don't get affected by silence. If you've got the word no, and you say it in isolation, no, where the N therefore is adjacent to silence, you don't get devoicing of the N, no. Or at least, if you do, you can't hear it. It's a matter of saying when does the syllable actually begin. So after all, if I say, you can't hear anything as I just breathe out gently through the nose, the way of measuring where the N starts is when you get actual noise, which is going to be voicing. No. So that's why we present the rules for beginners in terms of no devoicing at word edges or adjacent to silence for the sonorants, but yes for the obstruents, and likewise in these clusters.